Every Spartan boy who survived the agoge, the brutal state education that began at age 7, understood one truth above all others. Glory was not found in living, but in how one met the end. The Spartan word for the highest honor was kalos thanatos, a beautiful death. What follows is the story of those who earned it, those who were denied it, and those who discovered, at the last, that Sparta's greatest enemies were never the Persians or the Athenians, but Sparta itself. Leonidas I, king of Sparta, died 480 BC, Thermopylae. He knew before the battle began that he would not return. Leonidas I, king of Sparta, had consulted the oracle at Delphi before marching north. The prophecy was unambiguous. Either Sparta would fall, or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas chose himself. He selected his 300 not by chance or rotation, but with deliberate, somber intention. He chose only men who already had living sons, men whose bloodlines would continue after they were gone. It was an act of love disguised as strategy, and the soldiers who accompanied him understood exactly what it meant. The Persian army of Xerxes was not a force. It was a horizon that moved. Contemporary sources spoke of 2 million men, numbers so vast that historians have debated them for centuries. Modern estimates settle on perhaps 150,000 to 300,000. Still, a tide that dwarfed anything the Greek world had seen. Against this, Leonidas held a mountain pass, 4 meters wide, with roughly 7,000 Greeks, 300 of whom were Spartan. For 3 days, they held. The Battle of Thermopylae, August 480 BC, was a tactical impossibility made possible by terrain and discipline. The Persians could not flank the Greeks. They could only walk forward into the Spartan wall of shields and spears, the famous othismos, the push. Wave after wave broke against the phalanx. Xerxes reportedly watched from his throne and rose 3 times in alarm as his elite immortals were slaughtered. On the second day, a local shepherd named Ephialtes betrayed the Greeks for reward money, revealing a mountain path that would let the Persians outflank the pass entirely. "Go, tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Simonides of Chios, epitaph for the Spartan dead at Thermopylae. On the morning of the 3rd day, Leonidas learned his position was compromised. He dismissed most of the allied Greek forces. The Thespians famously stayed by choice, 700 men who refused to leave, and the Thebans were held as potential hostages. Leonidas gathered his 300 for the last time. The accounts of what he said differ. Some record silence. Others a grim joke about eating well, for that night they would dine in Hades. They advanced from the pass and drove into the Persian forces, no longer defending but attacking, making the enemy pay the highest possible price for what was already given. Leonidas fell in the forward press of battle, cut down by Persian spears after fighting deep into the enemy formation. The remaining Spartans formed a circle around his body and fought until their spears were broken, and then their swords, and finally used their hands and teeth. Xerxes, infuriated by the defiance, ordered Leonidas's head cut off and his body crucified, a profound violation of Greek burial customs, and proof, if any were needed, of how deeply those 300 had wounded Persian pride. Cause of death: killed in close combat. Thermopylae, Greece, August 480 BC. Age approximately 60. Cleomenes I, king of Sparta, died approximately 490 BC. Sparta. No Spartan king was more brilliant, more feared, or more completely undone by his own nature than Cleomenes I. He had ruled Sparta for roughly 3 decades, manipulating Greek politics with a cunning so sharp it bordered on the supernatural. He had forced Demaratus, his co-king, his rival, from the throne through bribery and conspiracy. He had intervened in Athens to overthrow tyrannies. He had humiliated Argos, Sparta's ancient nemesis, slaughtering thousands of Argive soldiers in a sacred grove in one of the more controversial incidents of the age. He was brilliant, ruthless, and in the end, completely mad. The story of Cleomenes' death is one of the most disturbing in Spartan history. After a period of exile driven out by political enemies following the Demaratus scandal, he returned to Sparta, apparently having lost his grip on sanity. Ancient sources describe him going about Sparta, striking his own countrymen in the face with his staff, laughing to himself. The ephors had him arrested and confined in the stocks. There, alone in his cell, Cleomenes obtained a knife from a helot guard through what Herodotus describes as sheer force of manner and regal insistence. He then carved himself to pieces methodically, deliberately beginning with his shins, moving to his thighs, then his legs, then his abdomen. He died before he reached his neck. The Spartans said he had gone mad from drinking undiluted wine, a scandalous habit he allegedly learned from Scythian envoys. The Argives said it was divine punishment for burning their sacred grove. The Athenians had other theories. Modern historians suspect he was suffering from severe mental illness, possibly exacerbated by the enormous pressure of maintaining his political position across 3 decades. Whatever the cause, the death was so disturbing that it was recorded by virtually every major Greek historian. A wound in the historical record that even 2,000 years of distance cannot sanitize. Cause of death: self-inflicted wounds while imprisoned, Sparta, approximately 490 BC. Pausanias, the regent of Sparta, died approximately 470 BC. Sparta. He was the hero of Plataea, the man who had commanded the allied Greek forces to the single greatest land victory against Persia, the battle that more than even Thermopylae actually ended Xerxes' invasion. At Plataea in 479 BC, Pausanias led the Spartans and their allies against the Persian general Mardonius in a brutal engagement that killed Mardonius and shattered the Persian army. The spoils were staggering. The honor was total. Pausanias returned home carrying the glory of all Greece on his red-cloaked shoulders. But victory had corrupted Pausanias in a way that Persian arrows never could. He developed a taste for Persian luxury, for Eastern culture, for the idea that he was something more than a Spartan regent. Intelligence reached Sparta that he had been conducting secret negotiations with Xerxes, offering to betray Greece in exchange for a position of power. He was recalled, tried, and acquitted for lack of direct evidence. But the suspicion clung to him like smoke. When letters were discovered later, or perhaps manufactured depending on which source one trusts, suggesting ongoing treasonous correspondence, the ephors moved against him. Pausanias received warning that arrest was imminent. In desperation, he read to the sanctuary of Athena of the Brazen House, a temple on the Spartan Acropolis, sacred ground where the laws of sanctuary applied. The ephors could not drag him out without committing a serious religious violation. Their solution was coldly practical. They bricked up the entrance to the temple and removed the roof, then stood guard and waited. His own mother is said to have placed the first stone. Pausanias starved to death in the darkness of the sanctuary. The hero of Plataea slowly reduced to bones in a building that was simultaneously his refuge and his tomb. His body was removed just before actual death to prevent the pollution of the sacred ground, and he expired on the temple steps. Cause of death: starvation. Temple of Athena, Sparta, approximately 470 BC. Brasidas, Spartan general, died 422 BC. Amphipolis. In the long war between Sparta and Athens, what we call the Peloponnesian War, most Spartan generals were straightforward instruments of destruction, disciplined, tactically competent, and imaginatively dull. Brasidas was the magnificent exception. He was bold where they were cautious, swift where they were methodical, and most startlingly for a Spartan officer, genuinely charming. He could speak. Not the blunt minimum word aphorisms Spartans were famous for, but persuasively, movingly, in ways that turned cities from Athens to Sparta without a siege. He was, in the words of his own enemies, the greatest advertisement Sparta had for itself. Brasidas arrived in Thrace in 424 BC at the head of a force combining Spartan officers with freed helots, a revolutionary decision in itself, and proceeded to peel away Athenian colonies one after another through a combination of lightning marches, tactical brilliance, and political seduction. His greatest prize was Amphipolis, a strategically vital Athenian colony on the Strymon River, which he captured before the Athenian general Thucydides, yes, that Thucydides, could arrive with relief forces. The fall of Amphipolis was so humiliating that Thucydides was exiled from Athens and used his decades of exile to write the history of the entire war. Brasidas thus created both a military crisis for Athens and the man who would become antiquity's greatest historian. He was a man who, more than any other Spartan, inspired the rest of Greece with the belief that the Spartans were like himself. Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, the Battle of Amphipolis, 422 BC, was brief and decisive and lethal to both sides. Athens sent Cleon, an aggressive, populist politician who had previously boasted he could take Amphipolis in 20 days with a relief army. Brasidas had learned of the approach and prepared. When Cleon advanced incautiously to reconnoiter the city walls, Brasidas launched a sudden, well-organized sally. The Athenian formation broke. Cleon was killed, reputedly trying to she. But Brasidas, leading from the front as always, was struck by a javelin and fell in the pursuit. He was carried back into Amphipolis while the battle was still going on around him. He lived long enough to learn the outcome, a complete Spartan victory. Then he died. The people of Amphipolis buried him in the center of their city, built a monument over him, and declared him their official founder, a divine honor. They offered annual sacrifice at his tomb and held games in his honor. A non-Athenian, non-Spartan city chose a Spartan general as its patron hero. That says more about Brasidas than any epitaph could. Cause of death: javelin wound in battle. Amphipolis, Thrace, 422 BC. Age approximately 45. Lysander, Spartan admiral and general. Died 395 BC. Haliartus. Lysander won the Peloponnesian War. That sentence, blunt as any Spartan aphorism, barely captures what it means. After 27 years of grinding conic sieges, plagues, naval disasters, political collapses, it was Lysander who delivered the killing blow, destroying the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami in 405 BC with a tactical surprise so complete it ended the war in a single afternoon. He then sailed to Athens, blockaded Piraeus, and watched the great city starve into submission. When Athens surrendered, Lysander's allies argued for genocide, burning the city, enslaving the population. Lysander refused. The city that had given birth to democracy, tragedy, and philosophy was allowed to stand, though its walls were torn down to the music of lutes. The victory made Lysander the most powerful individual in the Greek world. But power of that kind was complicated for a Spartan. Their constitution was specifically designed to prevent any one man from accumulating too much influence. 2 kings, 5 ephors, checks and balances everywhere. Lysander was technically neither king nor ephor, but had accumulated influence that dwarfed both. He placed his own men in positions of power across the Aegean, built a network of personal loyalty that alarmed even his own city, and according to some ancient sources, quietly explored the possibility of changing Spartan law to allow men of his brilliance, men who were not of royal blood, to be eligible for the kingship. His nemesis was King Agesilaus, whom he had personally helped place on the throne of Sparta, believing the young king would be a useful instrument. Agesilaus instead proved his own man entirely, and systematically dismantled Lysander's influence with a patient ferocity that Lysander himself might have admired in another context. By the time of the Corinthian War in 395 BC, Lysander was a diminished figure, still respected, still lethal, but no longer supreme. He was commanding a diversionary campaign in Boeotia when he led his force against the city of Haliartus in central Greece, apparently without waiting for the planned coordination with King Pausanias's army. Why he attacked alone is debated. Some say it was military impatience. Others suggest he was trying to recapture his old, independent glory. Whatever the reason, Lysander led his troops up to the walls of Haliartus just as a Theban relief force arrived. He was killed in the fighting beneath the walls, one of history's greatest admirals dying in a chaotic land skirmish outside a minor Boeotian city. His body left on the battlefield when his force was driven off. The man who ended Athens did not get a beautiful death. He got a muddy, confused melee and an unmarked grave before his men retrieved him later. Cause of death: killed in battle beneath city walls. Haliartus, Boeotia, 395 BC. Agis, the second king of Sparta, died approximately 398 BC. Sparta. King Agis II ruled Sparta through its most triumphant period, the final years of the Peloponnesian War and the beginning of Spartan hegemony over Greece. His military record was long and complicated. He had devastated Attica during the Archidamian War with near-annual invasions, humiliated the Argives at the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC, one of the largest hoplite engagements in Greek history, and commanded Spartan strategy through the final years of the war with Athens. But the story his contemp remembered most was not his victories. It was his wife. During his long absence campaigning, his young wife, Timaya, had begun an affair with the Athenian exile Alcibiades, the same Alcibiades who had convinced Athens to send the disastrous Sicilian expedition, then defected to Sparta, then defected to Persia, then attempted to return to Athens. Timaya reportedly bore a son she called Leotychides, but whispered to her servants that the boy's real name, the name she called him in private, was Alcibiades. Agis rejected the child. The boy grew up under the cloud of illegitimacy, was eventually stripped of succession rights, and the resulting political vacuum was part of why Lysander was able to engineer the accession of Agesilaus to the throne instead. Agis died not on a battlefield but in transit, returning from the oracle at Delphi. He fell gravely ill somewhere on the road in Arcadia, near the town of Herea. He was carried to Sparta by his retinue as his condition deteriorated, dying before he could reach the city. An undramatic end for a king who had commanded some of the most dramatic battles of the age. The illness was unspecified in ancient sources. He was succeeded by his brother Agesilaus, the man Lysander had championed over his own son. Cause of death: illness while traveling near Herea, Arcadia, approximately 400 to 389 BC. Agesilaus II, king of Sparta, died 360 BC. Near Cyrene, Libya, he was small, lame in one leg from birth, and king of Sparta for 40 years. He was one of the greatest military commanders of antiquity, possibly the greatest of all Spartans in terms of sheer career longevity, and he was, in the long run, the man most responsible for Sparta's decline. Agesilaus II was made of genuine greatness, brilliant on the battlefield, intensely loyal to his friends, possessed of a dry Spartan humor that his biographers found irresistible. Xenophon, who was his personal friend and wrote a biography of him, could barely conceal his adoration. Plutarch wrote of him as a near-perfect Spartan type. And yet, in 396 BC, Agesilaus led a Spartan expedition into Asia Minor, the first time a major Greek force had campaigned deep in Persian territory since the 10,000. He won engagement after engagement, pushing into the Persian heartland with a momentum that genuinely alarmed Artaxerxes II. Then, Persia did something clever. Instead of fighting Agesilaus in Asia, they paid Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Thebes to start a war at home. It worked. Agesilaus was recalled before his Asian campaign could reach its potential. The years of Spartan hegemony that followed were years of overreach. Agesilaus directed Spartan policy with an iron grip, refusing compromises, alienating potential allies, and most catastrophically, refusing to believe that Thebes, under Epaminondas, represented a genuine military threat. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the Spartan army suffered its most catastrophic defeat in history. 400 of the 700 Spartiates present were killed. The invincibility of the Spartan phalanx was shattered forever, and Sparta's ability to dominate Greece died on that field. Agesilaus had refused to be present at Leuctra. The decision came from other commanders, but his policies had created the political conditions for it. When someone asked him what great thing he had accomplished in life, Agesilaus replied, "I have been ruled by the laws all my days." Plutarch. Life of Agesilaus. In old age, very old age, past 80, Agesilaus did something few Greek kings had ever done. He hired himself out as a mercenary general to Egypt. Sparta needed money after Leuctra. Agesilaus, limping and gray, sailed to North Africa and fought effectively for the Egyptian pharaoh Nectanebo II in his wars against Persia. He was reportedly paid 30 talents of silver. He began the journey home with the money, but died at sea, or more precisely, died at an anchorage on the Libyan coast called the Harbor of Menelaus, either from exhaustion, illness, or the accumulated weight of 84 years. His body was preserved in wax. Sparta could not award the spices and shipped home. He was buried in Sparta with full royal honors, though the Sparta he returned to was not the Sparta he had served for 4 decades. The city that had dominated Greece for 30 years was now a secondary power, its population decimated, its prestige broken, its great military tradition running on empty. Agesilaus had been great enough to keep the machine running. He was not great enough to reimagine it. Cause of death: illness/old age. Harbor of Menelaus, Libya, 360 BC. Age approx 84. Callicratidas, Spartan admiral, died 406 BC. Battle of Arginusae. He was everything Lysander was not, and perhaps because of that he was loved in ways Lysander never was. Callicratidas became commander of the Spartan Eat in the Aegean War as a direct counterweight to Lysander's growing influence. The Spartan authorities were already alarmed by the admiral's cult of personality and his Persian financial connections. Where Lysander courted the Persian satrap Cyrus with gifts and addery to fund his fleet, Callicratidas refused to beg for Persian money. He said, reportedly, that if Sparta was to rule the sea, it should do so on Spartan terms, not as a client of Asian monarchs. It was a magnificent principle and a military handicap. At the Battle of Arginusae in 406 BC, Callicratidas faced the Athenian fleet with a force equipped without Persian subsidies, undermanned, and undersupplied. The battle was a catastrophe for Sparta. Callicratidas lost 70 ships and roughly 10,000 men. In the chaos of the engagement, his own flagship was rammed. He fell from the deck into the Aegean Sea, encased in bronze armor, and sank. His body was never recovered. Athens won the battle, but would squander the victory in one of the most self-destructive political episodes of the entire war. The assembly voted to execute the winning Athenian admirals for failing to rescue drowning sailors in the aftermath, eliminating the very commanders who had just defeated Sparta. Athenian democracy occasionally was its own worst enemy. Cause of death: drowned after falling from flagship. Battle of Arginusae, 406 BC. Cleombrotus, the first king of Sparta, died 371 BC. Leuctra. The Battle of Leuctra was the end of something. Not just the death of one Spartan king, but the death of an idea. The idea of Spartan invincibility that had been building since Thermopylae, since Plataea, through the decades of the Peloponnesian War. Cleombrotus I was the king who presided over that ending. He did not want the battle. He had been conducting a hesitant, inconclusive invasion of Boeotia when political pressure from Sparta demanded he either fight or retreat, and retreat was not an option a Spartan king could choose. The Theban general, Epaminondas, had studied the Spartan system with obsessive precision and found its fatal structural weakness. The Spartans always put their best men. the full Spartiates on the right wing. Every army since Homer had done the same. Against other armies, this worked because both right wings tended to win simultaneously, pushing the battle into a wheeling pursuit. Against Epaminondas, it was fatal. He stacked his left wing 50 shields deep, the famous oblique formation, and drove it straight at the Spartan right, smashing the Spartiate core before the rest of the battle had even properly begun. Cleombrotus was in the thick of the Spartan right wing when it collapsed. He was wounded and fell, carried from the field in the rout, dying of his wounds shortly after. 400 of 700 Spartiates present died. There were, at the time of Leuctra, approximately 1,000 full Spartiate citizens who had passed through the agoge and maintained their social standing in all of Sparta. 400 died at Leuctra in one afternoon. The military class of Sparta, already decimated by generations of slave revolt, earthquake, and the casualties of 30 years of near-continuous war, never recovered. Cleombrotus died as a Spartan king should in battle, fighting. The tragedy was not his death. The tragedy was what his death measured. Cause of death: battle wounds. Archidamus II, king of Sparta, died approximately 427 BC, Italy. He counseled against the war. In Thucydides' account, Archidamus II delivered one of antiquity's great anti-war speeches to the Spartan assembly in 432 BC, a detailed, practical, unsentimental argument for patience, negotiation, and the recognition that Athens could not be beaten quickly because of its wealth, its eat, and its empire. He spoke for caution in a room full of men whose entire culture was organized around the contempt for caution. The vote for war passed anyway. Archidamus led the invasions of Attica that bore his name, the Archidamian War, with professional competence, though the strategy never achieved its intended result. Athens simply didn't come out to #gut. Archidamus died not in battle and not at home, but on campaign in Italy. He had led a Spartan force to assist the city of Taurus, modern Taranto, in its connex with the native Messapians. The exact circumstances of his death are murky, possibly killed in battle, possibly succumbing to wounds or illness during the Italian campaign. He died far from Laconia, in a corner of the Greek world distant from the great struggle to which he had devoted his reign. He had been right about the war. Being right had not helped. Cause of death: killed on campaign, southern Italy, approximately 427 BC.